All right, we're up and running again. Welcome back. As always, I will try to be as fast as I can. But there's a lot to say about Congress. Let's see how fast I can get through it. So here's the view of the Capitol. I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. It's a nice place to visit. I don't know that I'd want to live there, but I'd consider it. But anyway, silly discussion question number one here might be something we'll talk about when we meet screen to screen here. But which of the following institutions do you trust the most? Right? We know that the first three articles of the Constitution map out the Congress, the presidency, and then the Supreme Court. These are the branches of government. It's likely that you do not trust Congress the most. If it's just a general question about the presidency, we tend to trust the president more than Congress. The data shows that kind of depends on who's president and how we tend to vote, of course. The Supreme Court we'll talk about in a couple weeks, more specifically in greater detail. The data tells us that trust in the Supreme Court is eroding by the minute, practically. Right now in the early 2020s. But anyway, here's the data to show you that we tend not to like Congress, right? This is not from any of the textbooks, but it's worth having a look at. The Gallup poll is pretty trustworthy. Going back to 1975, I mean, we've never really trusted Congress that much. Like happened with the president, George W. Bush, the presidency, etc. After September 11th, of course, support for government spiked way up to historic levels practically never seen before. In the case of Congress, that's probably true. Fast forward to the early years of the Trump administration, and you can see that support's below 20%. We don't like Congress. But let's talk about what it is. Nonetheless, here, I mean, just because we don't like it doesn't mean we can ignore it. But Congress is the first branch of government. We know it's Article 1 of the Constitution. It's more independent and powerful than legislatures in many other industrialized countries. And that's because most democracies use a parliamentary system. Now, this class isn't the time to go into great detail about this, but prime ministers, like of the UK or France, or well, not so much France, but there's a prime minister in France, but that's a bad example. The UK, trying to think of other examples. The Chancellor of Germany is a prime minister. What that prime means is that they're the first minister in the parliament. So the leader of the executive is also a member of the legislative branch, right? That's not what we do in the United States. We have what we call a presidential system, as do a lot of other countries throughout, particularly the Americas. The president is not a part of the legislative branch, right? And that makes Congress more independent than the Parliament in the United Kingdom, for example. I'll leave it at that without going into detail. Congress is meant to be pretty powerful. Again, that's why Congress was mapped out in Article 1 of the Constitution, right, which outlines the powers of Congress and is by far the longest article of the Constitution. Why is that? Because it gives the Congress a lot of powers. Power to tax and spend, to raise an army, to declare war, to regulate commerce, literally in the Constitution, interstate commerce, to print money. And I talked superficially a couple weeks ago about the necessary and proper clause, which gives Congress a lot of wiggle room to make any laws that it can claim are necessary and proper for it to carry out its congressional duties, right? Today, presidents play a much bigger role in each of these areas. The Congress hasn't declared war since World War II, for example. What Congress does is it's voted to authorize the president to use force at the president's discretion, right? That's not what the founders had in mind. We tend to blame presidents for taxing and spending, but it's Congress that ultimately has those powers constitutionally, right? So basically, it's just easier to blame the president or to give the president credit, depending on where your politics lie and how you view what happens with policy. But the fact of the matter is, and we'll talk about this more next week, I believe, the subsequent 2 weeks, as we talk about the expansion of presidential power over time. I'd rather focus on things like representation this go around than going back and forth comparing the Congress immediately to the executive branch. But Congress is the most important representative institution in government. It's the one that most directly represents us, the individuals, in no small part because we vote for our one member of the House directly and our two senators from whatever state we vote in directly, thus making it the most directly representative institution in government, right? Thus, a member's primary responsibility is to the constituency, right? Those people who live in the district that a member of the House represents or the state that a senator represents, right? Again, a member's primary responsibility is to the constituency. But the $1,000,000 question then becomes what constitutes fair and effective representation, right? That is hard to say, right? We can think, before we think about the demographics of things, let's think about how members of Congress represent their districts, right? This is explained in Lowy and mapped out this way, right? If you do have a problem with the federal government, if you have some complaint about how you've been poorly treated, if you're abroad and you need help, you can contact your member of the House, your representative, or your senators directly, and in limited ways, they can help you individually, right? So members of Congress can help us individuals, right? They can cater to organized interests by introducing legislation, say on behalf of business interests, on behalf of mobilized citizens in a group, in an interest group. We'll talk about that when we talk more about interest groups in particular. They can definitely make promotional speeches and symbolic gestures to organize interest, and that's often just to kick the can down the road. Members of Congress obviously represent the district as a whole, or senators represent their states as a whole by obtaining federal projects, money from the federal government to do things in the district or in the state. They can do things that nominally are meant to promote employment, create jobs. You hear that job creation come up a lot when it comes to election time, right? Either members of Congress touting what they've done thus far in their position or what they will do if elected to better the economic welfare of their constituents, right? To do that, they have agency, right? Members of Congress have agency. They're held accountable to their constituents if they fail to represent them properly, right? This is the very notion of the principal-agent relationship, right? We're the principals as the voters, and the agent has agency, right? Agency can be used in two different ways. I like how Lowy makes the distinction here. Legislators can act as delegates, where they see themselves as perfect agents of others, right? They're thus elected to do what we want them to do, right? To do the bidding of those who sent them to the legislature, to their constituents, right? That's how I tend to think of this principal-agent relationship working, right? However, many people who make it to Congress do ultimately view themselves, I think, in practice, whether they want to admit to it or not, as trustees, right? A legislator who makes decisions, who votes on policy, on bills, based on what they think is best for the constituency, right? So really, the delegate, is meant to listen to the constituents better, more, I would say. And a trustee is one who tends to think they know what's best, right? I like my representatives, again, to be delegates, but some folks put blind trust in their elected officials and look at them as trustees and are happy when such decisions are made. That's up to you to decide, and we can maybe talk about this when we reconvene. But let's continue on here thinking about descriptive representation, right? When we talk about this, now we're talking about shared characteristics and experiences that would allow a representative to share and draw support from those with whom they share an identity, right? It tends to be that, rural states, sparsely populated states like Wyoming, tend to elect people to both the House and the Senate who tend to look like the people of Wyoming. It's easier to obtain this in smaller, less populated districts and states, right? Thus, when we start thinking about the demographics of Congress, you can see that descriptive representation for African Americans and Hispanics has been facilitated by majority-minority districts. But to remedy the problem that historically there's been little descriptive representation, as over time, for the last couple hundred years and change, we've tended to elect only, white men, often elderly or often getting up there in years, we'll say, often pretty wealthy, often lawyers by training, et cetera, et cetera. And not all of us are old white lawyers, right? Male white lawyers. Shortcomings for others, of course. Very little Native American representation in Congress to speak of ever. increasing numbers of LGBTQ plus candidates and thus Congress people. Atheists, not very well represented. And the class division, right? Inequality as it grows. And we still have next to no one who's ever, worked as an adult for minimum wage, at least in Congress. I think this helps to understand why decisions tend to perpetuate this structural advantage of business within our democracy, as Katznelson discussed in the first weeks of class. But if you look at this here, this is straight out of the 17th edition of the Lowy book. You can see the demographics of members of the 117th Congress. Average age in the House, 58 years. Average age in the Senate, 64. And you see the range, right? You got to be 25 to be elected to the House, 30 to be elected to the Senate. And the numbers skew toward the old, right? And there you go. You can see occupation of the 435 members of the House. Most people are focused by occupation in business, law, and public service. The public service thing can make some sense. Might not hurt if there were more people with a stronger background in education, I would say, at all levels of government. But there you have it, right? Those with an education background are pretty outnumbered. A little better represented, I guess, in the House or in the Senate, but not by much, right? And overwhelmingly, a lot of lawyers, right? Which, again, can make some sense on the surface, but I kind of wish there were more people with more diverse occupational interests and experiences in Congress as well. There's a lot of flawed representation, I would say, that goes beyond race and ethnicity and so on and so forth, right? Education as well, probably good that most folks would have at least a high school degree, I would assume. But in the House and Senate, you can see, again, law degrees make up a disproportionate amount of those in both chambers, right? I personally wish there were maybe more folks with PhDs, but we tend not to like smarty pants intellectuals in this country. Religion, not a lot to say there. Underrepresentation on the part of many religions in the country. The gender imbalance is perfectly clear. I don't know that I need to say much about that, as is the case with race and ethnicity. If we compare these numbers as a percentage of both bodies with the percentage of say African Americans or Asian Pacific Islanders, etc., within the broader population, right? And you can see here too the congressional service. Folks on average in the House serve 4.5 terms for nearly 10 years. And folks in the Senate tend to serve almost 2 terms. That's because it's easy to get reelected. I'll talk about this in a second. Looking at California, we read a chapter of Van Vechten for this time around. You can see here that the California legislature also does not really line up with the demographics of the state either, right? You can see an overrepresentation of white constituents in the state, and an underrepresentation, particularly of Latinos. It's a bit better in the state of California for African Americans and Asians, but again, the white voters are overrepresented in the California legislature, and again, the gender imbalance is pretty clear, 50-50 for the state as a whole, and it's over 3/4 to under 1/4 on gender lines in the state legislature. Shifting gears to think about how Congress is structured. It's bicameral, a bicameral legislative assembly composed of 2 chambers or houses. You'll hear me use these terms pretty much interchangeably. The Senate is the upper chamber in the United States. It's smaller and more deliberative with 100 members, right? 2 per state. I'm sure I've got a question on the next exam about this one. So know these basic facts. The House is larger. The House of Representatives is larger with 435 members. And thus, because its membership is a lot harder to keep in line, power is more centralized in the leadership, and the general process of the House is more organized. I'll explain what that means in a sec. This is just some basic info. If you look at the textbook, you see these in brief boxes. I don't leave them in many of the slides, but I figure here this might be convenient for you to see and have to take a look at. You can see in the Senate, 100 members, 2 per state, right? In the House, 435 House members, and distribution of that membership by state is based on state populations, right? So the states with the least amount of people have one. Wyoming, Delaware, where I did my PhD, just one. California has over 50, right? And this has grown over time. One member of the House back in 1789 represented about 30,000 people. Today, that's over 700,000, right? But the constituency, the interest within districts, within states in particular, especially larger states like California, the interests tend to be local, right? Since senators represent their entire state, their constituencies' interests tend to be statewide and even spill over into the national, right? That's why national politics tend to affect Senate races much more than they do House races. Looking at the California legislature, it resembles the U.S. Congress in form, in that it's bicameral with two houses, an upper house, which is also the Senate, and a lower house, with different membership numbers and lengths of terms. Sorry, I can't speak. They're also similar in function, as they're designed to check each other. Right, that's the nature of a bicameral system. Right, you need both houses to agree on something to pass legislation. Right, that's to prevent again the tyranny of the majority, and to protect the minority political interests within the state, or in the case of California, or the country in the case of the U.S. House and Senate. The design of the California Senate, again, it's the upper house. There are 40 members. Each state senator in California represents over 931 people, which is to say more than any individual member of the U.S. House, which is a bit surprising. The numbers, if you're not from California, the numbers just sound off the charts. I was born in Kansas and followed Kansas politics a lot more closely than California politics. And yeah, the numbers, whenever I have to think about California, it boggles my mind. It's the size of a big country, really. Democrats are the majority in the Senate, and senators in the state of California are elected to 4-year terms. The lower house in the assembly is made up of 80 members, so they represent about half. Their constituency about half the size of a member of the state Senate in California. They're also elected for 4-year terms. So don't let those distinctions, come test time, because I will ask you these questions. Don't let them confuse you. U.S. Senate, 6-year terms. U.S. House, 2-year terms. California, both houses, 4-year terms. Democrats are also the majority in the House, or in the Assembly, the lower house in California. Let's think about who runs for Congress. This is from the Lowy text, but it also really applies to California too. But because members of Congress are aiming to be agents, electoral considerations are very important, right? So you don't want to run to be an agent knowing you're going to lose, right? I mean, I guess people do it, but you're basically looking at a real ambitious group of folks who tend to have access to money, whether that's their own. Is one question, but they really must be able to raise a lot. Campaigns in this country are very expensive. Having name recognition and a strong political or a strong political base tends to help. I think that's how Arnold Schwarzenegger became, your governor in California about 20 years ago after a recall, a total recall, if you will. That's a late 80s joke. But it helps to have name recognition when you're running for office. It helps us to be charismatic and have pretty strong personal organization, right? You can't ask for extensions. The folks who ask for extensions on their homework all the time probably aren't going to grow up and run for Congress, is what my gut tells me. But anyway, I mentioned a couple slides ago that once elected, it's really easy to get reelected. Let's flesh this out just a little bit. Incumbency is the term, right? An incumbent is the term we use to describe someone who's running for re-election. They hold the office already. Holding the political office for which you're running is a good way, if you're going to bet on electoral results, to determine who wins, right? It has really important advantages in congressional elections. which include casework and patronage, right? A track record to be able to say, hey, here's what I've done for the district, here's what I've done for the state, thus you should vote for my reelection. Pork barrel legislation, or earmarks as they're called, these are increasingly less of a reality by law, but oftentimes, and it's linked to casework, but oftentimes members of Congress, through legislation and amendments to legislation, can get things in a bill that brings money back to their constituency, right? So anytime an incumbent can say, literally, here's the money that I brought back to the district or to the state, that helps, right? That gets tends to get voters willing to vote for the person again. It also provides earlier access to fundraising. Early money is what I have here. And then, of course, name recognition. If you've been on the scene for a while, especially if you're a person like Dianne Feinstein, who's been the senator from California for quite a while and is in her 90s now, easy to get reelected when you've been around for a really, really, really long time. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, but it's a reality. Got a handful of senators in their 80s and 90s, I don't know. I'm not a fan. Here you see the power of incumbency with some data here. Representatives reelected by percentage. You can see the orange line here is the House going back to the mid 1960s. It's rarely below 90%, which is to say 90% of those, the 435 members of the House who have to run for reelection every 2 years, about 90% get reelected. Those are good odds, right? The Senate, the number's a bit lower. And you see a big drop off in the late 70s. This had a lot to do with Watergate. And then the Jimmy Carter administration from 1977 to 1981 was not a very successful presidency for a lot of reasons, but I think that eroded a lot of trust in the Senate. But even at its lowest, you still had over half of those running for reelection get reelected in the Senate, right? So again, incumbency is a powerful force. The hyperlink here, if I'm not mistaken, takes you to a Stephen Colbert clip, I think, a TV show, a satirical show that has been off the air for over a decade now. But he really makes fun of the fact that once you're running for re-election, you can basically just do or say what you want. It's quite satirical. It's a little funny. I kind of like it. I left it in there. Have a look if you like. Here's a quote from the Katznelson text. I'm not assigning the Katznelson texts for this portion of the semester anymore, but this is a good quote, right? In the early 19th century, congressional turnover was very high. In 1870, more than half of the representatives sent to the House were newly elected, right? A lot of turnover, less importance of incumbency. But by 1900, new members comprised less than 1/3. By 1940, less than 1/4. By 1998, less than 1/10. And that's what we saw on the previous slide, right? Which is to say, now, this day and age, well into the 21st century, running for re-election is the norm because, again, it's probably the best way to guess who's going to win a seat. Is there an incumbent? My money's on that person. Shifting gears back to California, let's talk about term limits. This was a restriction imposed by voters through an initiative, through a referendum in 1990. And it limits how long legislators can serve in either of the congressional, it was in the state assembly, up to 12 years, right? Remember, 4-year terms, so you can really only get reelected twice. After which there's a lifetime ban, right? You get reelected once or get elected once, reelected twice, up to 12 years. And after you hit 12 years of service, you cannot serve as a lawmaker again. Right. There's been a lot of talk about term limits for the U.S. Congress, but it would take U.S. Congress people, right, to vote for that to happen because we don't have a system for a national referendum, right, to ask the people what we think, right? So I don't see it happening anytime soon, term limits for the U.S. Congress. But anyway, money in congressional elections is very much a reality. I've mentioned money in the electoral process offhand, I think in every PowerPoint collection thus far, but this is one of the big reasons why congressional incumbents are so safe, is because they can raise and spend more money than their opponents do, and it's a safe assumption every election cycle when someone's running for re-election, so they can get started a lot earlier, right? And they don't have to worry about primary elections as a challenger would. So this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? As campaign donors don't want to give money to people who are going to lose, so they tend to funnel money to those who they think they can win, and incumbents usually win, right? So they get more money. So thus, again, representation is further limited by fundraising, right? Because we're not going to get a lot of the super old fuddy-duddy white guys and a couple of old fuddy-duddy white women out of Congress anytime soon, in no small part because of the role of money in politics. This hyperlink will take you to a John Oliver clip discussing this very point. I think it's quite funny. It's worth having a look if you're interested and frustrated by the role of money in politics. Let's look at the electoral system in regards to congressional districts. Right, every 10 years, every 0 year, 2000, 2010, 2020, there's a census, right? The Constitution requires that the federal government conduct a census to count people, everyone in the country. And that's used first and foremost to determine how House districts will be reapportioned among the states, right? So within a state like California, again, you've got over 50 congressional districts because the population is so large. Smaller states by population, again, Wyoming, Delaware, have just one. So these states with small populations don't have to worry about how the district lines are drawn, but in most states, that's the reality, right? California, Texas, New York, Pennsylvania, these larger states, Florida, use census data to then, according to state law, redraw lines to decide what the House districts will be. It, in effect, determines the constituency within those districts, right? And thus, there's a lot at stake in how these lines are drawn, as voters can be arranged so as to give an advantage to one political party or another. And there's a term for it. It's called gerrymandering, right? You've maybe heard of it, but this is where in a state like Florida, in which I believe the state legislature gets to decide the district lines. It's the same in Texas, same in Ohio. These are important and big states. And all of these state legislatures are controlled by Republicans. A few states, California is one of them, decided long ago via referendum, via initiative, to make this system, make this process as non-political as possible, right? But this matters, right? Because people move throughout the country. And that's why the census matters. That's why we take a census. But you can see over time, from 1960 to 1920, the orange bars are 1960. You had the apportionment of House seats by region, and you can see where over time, from 1960 to 2020, where populations have grown, right? And that's in the South and in the West, right? New England, the Mid-Atlantic states, the Midwest, all these regions have lost population as we've moved southward and westward over the last 70 years or so, or that's 60 years, I guess. But that's just been the trend, right? And that's why redrawing boundaries for the House is important, right? Let's talk about legislative organization here. Cooperation among many members is difficult. It's necessary to pass laws ultimately, but it's difficult for several reasons, right? Not everyone has the same interest, right? It's hard to match influence and interest among 435 members of the House and 100 senators, right? And because each member has particular priorities, but only one vote on every issue, right? Legislators, as individuals, are not experts on every policy. In every policy area, of course. So there's imperfect information. You got to, legislators, members of the House and Senate, have to trust leadership, have to ask their colleagues for advice, et cetera, et cetera. Compliance is another problem, if you will, air quote problem. Monitoring legislative deals and legislative outcomes requires collective effort, right? And party loyalty shifts over topic and time. We've seen regarding certain issues over the last 30, 40, 50 years. I'm thinking abortion. There used to be Democrats who were pro-life, who were anti-abortion, and there used to be Republicans who were in favor of abortion. That over time is less and less the case, right? So we can see party loyalty coalescing in certain issue areas over time. And then you can see parties also change. The Republican Party 10 years ago used to be very pro-free trade, and now it's not, since Donald Trump came in and shook things up. So, party loyalty, party interest can change over time too. Thinking about legislative organization in terms of parties, members organize themselves into a party coalition in the House and the Senate. It's called a caucus for Democrats and a conference for Republicans. Members choose within their caucus or conference their leadership, whether that's the Speaker of the House for the party that controls the House, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader of the Senate. These become pretty much the spokesperson for the party within the body, right? Members, the elected members, empower their party leaders to influence the agenda and manage legislation, especially in the House. Again, because there are a lot more members, which requires stronger, more direct leadership to get legislation passed, right? To facilitate that as well, each chamber is organized into standing committees that are divided by policy jurisdiction, right? And there's similar committees in the House and the Senate, and this is often called, these are the committees are viewed as gatekeepers. They have gatekeeping authority, which is the right to decide if a change in policy will be considered. The fact of the matter is most legislation dies in committee. So it doesn't go forth to the full chamber to be voted on. Not going to read through the list here, but you can see very quickly that there's a lot of overlap between the committees in the House and in the Senate. These are the big questions, the biggest of issues that our legislative branch needs to consider, whether that's agriculture, the armed services, of course, banking or finance, foreign affairs, foreign relations, natural resources, so on and so forth, right? The judiciary, of course, et cetera, veterans affairs, et cetera, right? These are the committees that initially oversee any proposed legislation that deals with these areas, right? That's the purpose of committees, right? Important to consider staffers and agencies, right? Each member of Congress has a staff that provides assistance on everything from writing legislation itself to corresponding with constituents. I mentioned weeks ago that you can contact your elected officials. You will get a response if you do. It's likely that any letter you get signed by your senator was probably written by a staffer, but it's the thought that counts. Committees also have staffers. They're meant to be non-political. Congress has also created staff agencies to provide nonpartisan policy advice to members, like the Congressional Budget Office. These are bureaucrats, not elected officials, that nominally have no overt political allegiance, that are meant to evaluate policy proposals and tell Congress, hey, if this law is passed like this, this is how much we think it's going to cost over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of staffers and agencies that are meant to provide non-political advice to our elected agents in their decision-making process, right? Let's think about caucuses. These are separate from the Democratic caucus. These are issue caucuses that are groups of senators and representatives who can be of different parties, who share certain opinions, interests, or social characteristics, right? These caucuses seek to advance the interests of groups they represent by promoting legislation and congressional hearings and working with administrative agencies. There are a ton of them. I could click on this, but I think I already have it pulled up. I'll show you. This is not one of these things that YouTube will take down, I certainly hope. Pardon my ugly picture in the corner. It's better than seeing my video face right now, I promise you. But if you look at caucuses in the Congress, Addiction Treatment and Recovery Caucus, probably something you didn't think would be a congressional caucus made up of people from both parties, but it is, right? The Afghanistan Caucus, the After School Caucus, you can see that we're all over the place. Agro-Tourism Caucus. Let me scroll way down out of the A's and just see, randomly pause here, the Minor League Baseball Caucus, right? The Missile Defense Caucus, right? These are all of the Mongolia Caucus. All of these things that different members of Congress, based on their own personal interests, can choose to serve on, right? To represent different electoral interests within the United States. How a bill becomes a law. Again, bill must first be introduced by a member of Congress, and then it's passed on to a committee, right? I just stressed the point that most bills die in committee, but it takes a positive vote, majority vote within a committee that are always broken down along party lines and more or less reflective of the proportional representation within either chamber. The committee makeup will be very similar. So if there are more Democrats in the House, you'll see more Democrats on a committee. And if there are more Republicans, let's say, on a committee in the Senate, or in the Senate, there are more Republicans, you'll see more Republicans outnumbering the Democrats on a given committee. And thus, bills proposed by members of the party that doesn't control the committee are the ones who are most likely to see their bills die, right? So very partisan. Some bills are referred to a subcommittee, and they can be amended and then are reported out to the full chamber. But that will also require a favorable vote by the full main committee, right? Anyway, I don't want to go into greater detail. I guess I could, but we don't need it. Bills reported out of committee, so that are passed, voted in favorably out of their committee, go then to the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives, which then determines the rules under which the bill will be debated on the floor, right? And it just takes a majority vote within the Rules Committee to decide that. Usually when bills need to be passed very quickly, especially if there's like a spending bill and a possible government shutdown, there usually be a closed rule which prohibits the introduction of amendments to the bill. An open rule can allow certain members from certain committees, or it can allow anyone in the House to add amendments to bills. This happens increasingly less because the more amendments that are included in a bill, sometimes amendments are included to gain more support for the bill. Often it just muddies the waters. And leads to representatives not wanting to vote for the bill. In the Senate, there's a different tradition of debate, and it's unlimited, right? It takes 60 votes in the Senate to invoke cloture or end of debate. There's not a committee that decides how the debate works. It takes 60 senators saying, we're done voting on this bill. Recently, greater partisanship in the Senate has meant that the minority frequently threatens to use the filibuster, which is a delaying tactic in which senators do not allow the debate to end, and that's meant to kill legislation. So it means if the party that controls the Senate doesn't have 60 votes, and really in my lifetime, it's only happened once, in your lifetime, it's only happened once, after the election of Barack Obama, when a senator from Pennsylvania, Arlen Specter, he's now deceased. He was born in Kansas, by the way, decided to switch parties and gave the Democrats a supermajority of 60 votes in the Senate. But other than that, the filibuster has very much been a reality. And you can see here, this is the most recent information I could find going back to 2020 or up to 2021. But you can see that since the 70s, the use of the filibuster has really exploded. Again, it's a tactic that the minority party in the Senate uses to block the passage of legislation that it doesn't like. And it's a bipartisan tactic. It's really hard to blame one party or the other. If you want to look at this data, you could say, the Republicans really kicked it off, more so shaping its contemporary use. You get a lot of people advocating that we should just do away with the filibuster. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. So, it doesn't have to be done. It's just that every Senate votes at the outset of its session for what the rules will be, and neither party is willing to get rid of the filibuster, right? Neither one, when it has the majority, because it knows that the next time around, the other party, if it has the advantage, will do away with the filibuster, and then we'll see a lot of legislation really just pushed through the Senate really quickly. Moving on, for a bill to become a law, it must be passed in exactly the same form in both chambers, the House and the Senate. Frequently, the two chambers send the bill back and forth until one chamber passes a version that was passed by the other. Sometimes what's called a conference committee is created, which is made up of members from both chambers to work out the differences and then repropose a unified bill for both chambers to vote on. Usually, when a conference committee produces a final version of the bill, it's a formality. We know it's going to pass. But the important takeaway here is, again, bills must be reconciled. Both chambers must pass the exact same bill for it to go to the president's desk for a signature or a veto, right? How a bill becomes a law. There it is. There it is, the hyperlink, the Schoolhouse Rock, which you may have seen as a kid. I saw it when I was a kid. It's been around a long time. But this is the I'm just a bill up on Capitol Hill. I can't sing for crap. But I would recommend watching this link. It's short and it does a very good job of explaining just exactly how a bill becomes a law. But once the bill is passed out of Congress by both chambers, the same exact bill, I just said this on the last slide, the president can veto or sign it into law. If a president vetoes the legislation, which is basically just a fancy way of saying no, Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote in each chamber. Right? It's increasingly difficult to obtain that. Vetoes are increasingly rare, simply because Congress doesn't pass laws that it knows it's going to get vetoed. Right? Congress looks bad when the president vetoes. A president doesn't want to veto and then get overridden. That makes a president look bad. But presidents can use that threat of a veto to shape legislation and try to avoid the embarrassment of having a veto overridden by Congress. So presidents don't directly participate in the legislative process, but politically they can still be pretty influential, right? How do members decide how to vote? Well, again, if they were delegates, I would hope they would listen to their constituents, because come election day, constituents have really the only effective check on their members of Congress, right? Interest groups can donate money to causes and use their lobbyists to try to influence how congressmen vote, congresspeople vote, members of Congress vote, but ultimately interest groups don't have a vote themselves, right? But interest groups can educate the public, mobilize constituents, and make campaign donations. This lobbyist clip, I believe, takes you to another John Oliver 20-minute satire clip, but very good, very analytical, very funny as well. Give that a watch if you like, if lobbyists annoy you too. Party voting. Members do still listen to party leaders. Well, they arguably more so today than they did before. I gave you the example on abortion, right? How there used to be Democrats who were against abortion, and there used to be Republicans who were in favor of it. Increasingly today, we find greater party unity, and thus, party voting really shapes how people voted. It becomes, especially the more important the legislation, the more surprising it is when a senator in particular crosses party lines to vote for a bill proposed by the other party. Interest groups are important. If you just look at this picture very quickly, you might wonder, what is this interest group? If you look closely, this isn't the elderly African-American ladies interest group. It's the AARP, right? Which stands for the American Association of Retired Persons. It is hands down the most influential interest group in the United States, more so than the NRA. If we were in class face to face, we could talk about this. We could talk about it when we reconvene via the screen. Old people vote, right? And Congress tends to listen to older people, right? Older people vote in higher numbers than younger people, and older people are much better organized. I'm not saying that the AARP does everything in the best interest of every old person that is alive and votes, but the AARP is going to make damn sure that Congress doesn't decide to slash Social Security anytime soon, or you'll have a lot of angry elderly voters, right? So that's why I left that in there. Party unity on the rise. I mentioned this 2 slides ago. You can see that party voting, party unity is not going anywhere. You see all votes in both chambers going up in the House and in the Senate, where now over 50% of the time you see every member of Party A voting for a bill, every member of Party B voting against that same bill, right? This is a sign of polarization at the highest levels of government, right? I blame the individual members of Congress, but I also blame us. I blame the media. there's a lot of blame to go around. I blame the two-party system. These are things that we can talk about throughout the semester. More evidence of the same: the widening ideological gap between the parties. You can see this. This is done by an organization called VoteView, and updated by Lowy, or the authors of the Lowy book. Lowy's dead. But you can see, I don't know exactly how they defined Republicans and Democrats as more conservative or more liberal, but you can definitely see in the House a greater move toward the extremes on the part of both parties, more liberal, more conservative, further away from the center, right? And that's not going to make policy making any easier. I am winding down. I promise I think I'm down to just a couple more slides. But the causes of increasing partisanship in Congress, still very relevant. Party leaders have greater power. Party leaders assign who gets on which committee. And this is important if you ever do get elected to the House or the Senate. You're going to want to be on certain committees and you're going to want to not be on other committees. And it's the party leadership that decides. Party leaders get to decide who speaks on the floor, particularly in the House. The whip system is how, it's a fancy way of describing how the party leadership tries to cajole its membership into voting with the party. Log rolling is a fancy word for trade-offs, political trade-offs, and leadership uses that in a way to empower certain members over others. And so if you cross party leadership, you can find yourself really on the outside looking in. And then, of course, party leaders can also increase the power and visibility for the president. So when we have unified government, when Congress is in, the party that controls Congress is the same as the party that controls the White House, you can see really an enhanced role for leadership within Congress for the purposes of decision making by committee, by teams, by party, between the executive and the legislative branches. This also boils back to gerrymandering as well, right? Partisanship in Congress can really be determined by who draws the lines for the districts, for the House within each individual state. This link will take you to a John Oliver clip last week tonight on gerrymandering. It's very funny. It's very frustrating. It will explain gerrymandering very well. I applaud you Californians for having a nonpartisan system to do that. Other states, Iowa has one. Iowa tends to be a much more conservative state than California, but its voters were, I think, wise enough, like the voters of California, to say we should depoliticize this process as best we can. But anyway, let's move back to the California legislature, and I'm about done. The districts they represent used to be drawn by the legislators themselves, but as I stated before, under an initiative in 2008, you now have a nonpartisan citizens redistricting commission that draws the lines, right? Which is meant to be as fair as possible to enhance, the best representation outcomes as possible and not favor one party or another, right? Size matters. In California, the state Senate districts contain more people than U.S. House districts. I've stated that before. This matters. And if we think about how decisions made in Sacramento can even influence the U.S. Congress, I'm thinking particularly about, say, emission standards for automobiles. It's important what California does, and it's important to know that state senators in California represent a hell of a lot of people. Beyond legislation, shifting back to the U.S. Congress, both chambers have the power of oversight, which is often very partisan. This is where, remember I said the committees are controlled by the party that controls the chamber. So you often see, if Republicans control the House or the Senate, you'll have different committees that then will provide oversight, which is basically just political criticism of members of the opposite party for whatever they've done, whatever the other party thinks they've done wrong. The Senate offers has the power to advise and consent to presidential decisions on, say, political appointees, to the Supreme Court, to the cabinet, so on and so forth. This is often very partisan. It tends to be less so when the Senate and White House are controlled by the same party. The Senate ratifies treaties, so international agreements that a president makes. These tend to be not as politicized, but still pretty politicized. And then, of course, impeachment is a congressional power that's kind of been in the news in recent years, right? The House votes to impeach a president or other members of the executive branch. And a vote to impeach is like an indictment. It basically says, we're accusing you of this political crime. The trial is in effect held in the Senate. It takes 2/3 of the members of the Senate to convict, which would then result in removal from office. It's never happened to a president's never been removed from office. Bill Clinton was, of course, impeached in 1998. Former President Trump was impeached twice, 2019 and 2021. Neither time removed from office. It's not a legal procedure in practice, although we kind of treat it that way. It's really just inherently partisan. And because of that fact, and because it's never really been successful, I think only one or two federal judges have ever been impeached and removed from the bench. So as a consequence, its utility has been called into question. So I've got two links here. One is an interview with someone, Ilhan Omar, representative from Minnesota, pretty progressive Democrat, and the other, a Republican. I forget who the interview's with. They're short, but it really makes me scratch my head and think about the futility of impeachment, really. But oversight is very much a real thing. Here's a photo of former Secretary of State and one-time presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, or presidential nominee, two-time candidate, who was forced to go under oversight hearings for the better part of 15 hours on one day, right before a primary debate against Bernie Sanders in 2015. And that was very political in nature, I think is safe to say, but very much a reality. And leads to this question: does Congress work, right? Because it didn't obviously work in derailing Clinton from getting the nomination from the Democratic Party in 2016, but it was also a good example of inefficiency, I would say, on the part of the Republican-controlled House at the time. But the bigger picture here I mean to stress is that it's often difficult to balance efficiency within Congress and constituent representation, in no small part because, and if you've watched any of the satirical links, you can see that members of Congress are often just wrapped up in their own self-interest of raising money and getting reelected. I think that really bumps full frontal with constituent representation. But building the supermajority coalitions necessary to pass legislation leads to a distributive tendency in legislation, right? Meaning that bills are frequently designed to distribute policy benefits as widely as possible, countrywide, statewide, district-wide, however you want to cut the cake. But that, becomes increasingly difficult to pass such policies when, again, with the filibuster, you've got the Senate putting the brakes on policy right and left. You've got committees killing bills right and left. And neither party wants the other party to get credit for doing a damn thing. And again, we just get frustrated as voters, and the polarization just continues its a vicious cycle. But anyway, we'll talk about all of these things. Well, not all of the things, but what you find most interesting. I'll definitely ask you what you think about Congress and how it works or doesn't when we meet via the screen. But anyway, I'm sure I went on longer than I wanted to. Apologize for that. We're done for now. Take care.